Anastasia, in other words, the person views spiritual knowledge, with help of which he can spiritually rise above the material world, from the perspective of a resident, observer, of three-dimensional space. And material thinking in the format of this dimension is limited, as a rule, by secret unfulfilled desires from the animal nature. Well, that's right, what else can the animal nature whisper to him? You haven't acquired secret power over others with this knowledge, and Anastasia, in other words, the person views spiritual knowledge, with help of which he can spiritually rise above the material world, from the perspective of a resident, observer, of three-dimensional space. And material thinking in the format of this dimension is limited, as a rule, by secret unfulfilled desires from the animal nature. Well, that's right, what else can the animal nature whisper to him? You haven't acquired secret power over others with this knowledge, and a material nimbus hasn't begun to shine above your head before the crowd. Where is the promised elevation? Rigdon, a certain lack of understanding of spiritual processes is undoubtedly present in a person at the first stages of his work on himself. On the outside, yes, nothing changes, the body with its problems continues to age. At first, the person does not notice that thanks to the primordial knowledge, he gets that other, the eternal, that which is much more important than all the three-dimensional, material, and mortal. The knowledge gives him a foundation for flourishing in him of spiritual power and wisdom. Knowing about his animal nature, in certain situations the person will already restrain its manifestations, stop himself, ignore a bad thought, thus changing his future, which would inevitably happen if he had actually allowed a thought from the animal nature to develop into a situation that is negative for his spiritual nature. While working on himself every day, he will help someone both with a word and will show an example to others with his good deed, will share spiritual knowledge with the others. And thus a person, more and more often, will make his conscious choice each day, that is, here and now. And from such here and nows, his whole life is woven. So such doubts are typical only for the one who is at the beginning of his process of spiritual development. But the one who already stands firmly on the spiritual path, changes himself radically, becoming aware more deeply of the meaning of his fleeting life. Each day such people hurry to do many good deeds for people and for the soul, both planned and completely accidental, increasing their personality's chance for spiritual salvation. So, while in firm position of the spiritual observer, as well as having primordial knowledge and working on himself, man gets practical keys to self-perfection and finds grains of the truth even if they are hidden in an elevator full of chaff. Anastasia, given the development of information technology, today people have time and opportunity to analyze the mistakes and experience of the past of the human civilization. Moreover, modern people have an opportunity to partially monitor the situation in the world on different aspects of life of the global society, thanks to, for instance, Internet technologies. Many facts of the life and activity of politicians and priests become public more often. This naturally entails an appropriate reaction on the part of society. People no longer trust the authorities. Many people have begun to realize who is cooking the soup of events for nations, colluding with the priestly and political clans, chefs in the kitchen of the world politics, economy and, most importantly, ideology. Many people have become aware who orders and who executes. But a conviction has been imposed upon people that the situation in society cannot be changed, that it has been so since the beginning of time. Although, in fact, people, nations, themselves are the ones who execute and participate in all these processes as well as consume the political or religious product. And so, many people understand the absurdity of this situation. They understand that it is impossible to live like this anymore. But they do not understand what needs to be done so that life in society truly becomes better, not on paper but in deed. How to change the channel of society's movement so that it enters the path of stimulating true cultural, moral, and spiritual development in a person, rather than continue to be stuck in a hopeless quagmire of the animal nature with its consumer format of thinking, wars, and discords. Rigdon, yes, unfortunately, the sentiment about hopelessness and inevitability of these processes has long been formed in the modern society, but in fact, there is a way out, and it is very simple. People need as much as possible to assess information, everyday life, and its events from the perspective of the observer from the spiritual nature, then they will better understand how to live and what to do. This is similar to the example of work on the purity of your consciousness. When a thought from the animal nature comes, ignore it, do not give it attention. It is better if you pay more attention to the good, to thoughts, deeds, and actions from the spiritual nature. It is the same in society, simply ignore all the bad things and multiply around you all the good, creating, and kind things. One must not be passive in the affairs of society. You yourself should not create conditions for the flourishing of stimuli that activate the animal nature in people, for example, cultivation of pride, of that same bribery, of monetary-driven, selfish relations instead of friendship, and so on. When most people stop supporting and putting into life the will of priests and politicians who stimulate aggression and qualities of the animal nature in peoples, then many artificially created problems will disappear from the society. It is just that one needs to understand that we are all humans and are all made from the same thing. None of us is higher or lower. We are all sitting in a barrel of material dirt, that is, we are confined in this material world, in this mortal body, with its eternal problems and inexhaustible desires. And at some point, everyone will have to answer for the lived life. Priests and politicians are also people who are on equal footing with everyone else. They are no different from others, except for the exorbitant thirst for earthly power and passion for the accumulation of wealth. Anastasia, that's right. Judging by the history of development of the human civilization, priests, just like politicians, were at all times dependent on the support of people, so they did everything to increase their authority among people using all sorts of methods, mainly those based on fears. But in fact, if the majority of people stopped supporting this or that religion, it faded away. Rigdon, you have rightly pointed out that it is just another religion that faded as a certain behavior pattern for the public consciousness but not people's faith in God. It is just that priests used this faith at all times, and, based on it, they created new, favorable for their regime templates, for the purpose of enslaving the public consciousness. Anastasia, at the time, after one memorable for me conversation with you, I thoroughly researched the issue of motivation and justification, at various times, by priests of the importance of this or that religion for the consciousness of peoples. And I found a number of interesting facts. In almost all beliefs, the emphasis was placed on the ritual of offering sacrifice to this or that god, which constituted the main act in a religious ceremony. Today, for example, in addition to traditional ceremonies, this is a commonplace donation of money for religious purposes. I remember the words you said back then. Do people at least remember what sacrifice to God is? After all, almost all the religious systems at different times were built around the ritual of sacrifice. Why since ancient times has sacrifice played such an important role in the worship services of different peoples? What you said later, was a real insight for me. Could you also tell the readers about this significant for humanity moment? Rigdon, well, it is worth it. I shall start, perhaps, with an ancient Slavic interpretation of the word, Jertva meaning sacrifice, translator's note, which, although it may sound amusing, captures the essence. I had once explained that the word, which appeared in the Russian language in the 11th century in connection with spread of the Christian religion, is derived from the verbal formation, an ancient Slavic word, zrug, I am making a sacrifice. And the word zrug, in its turn, was earlier used among the Slavs in the meaning of to gorge. The ancient Slavonic verb zrat is of the Indo-European origin, that is, to devour. By the way, devouring was connected with the ancient Russian word, zhavo, belly, stomach, translator's note, which in ancient times meant life. It is from it that the ancient Slavic word, zavono meaning animal, translator's note, is derived, which literally means that which lives. By the way, the words havonoi became widespread in the Kievan Rus specifically in the 11th to 12th centuries thanks to secret renewal of the primordial spiritual teaching, including about the four essences, by Agapit of Petchersk. Anastasia, so that means that the old Slavic heathen temples, especially those onto which special signs and symbols were drawn, were not sacrificial altars as such. Perhaps, in some cases these were publicly known places where for centuries people came to study spiritual knowledge, using signs and symbols, and to share their experience like, for instance, ancient people gathered in their sacred caves, studying petroglyphs. Rigdon, it will be easy for people to trace it, having had the basic spiritual knowledge. So, they later used the word, Jareti, I devour, translator's note, to indicate the word priest. If one traces the etymology of the related words, one can find that earlier it stood for one who boasts, reminds of himself, extols. Hence the origin among the people of the word priest, meaning, as one would say now, the real consumer of gifts brought to a conditional deity. By the way, in the old days in Rus, there was such a word as jertsovat in the English transcription, which also meant to gouge, to devour. It is derived from the word, jerts in the English transcription, meaning a bribe taker, oppressor, robber, offender. So people precisely described who is who in this world. If you search the meaning of the word victim, in Russian it is, jertva, translator's note, you can find that it means that which is being devoured, destroyed, and that which perishes. It is that which is given away or that which one loses permanently. This is self-sacrifice, renunciation of benefits and pleasures. In the religious beliefs of many nations, sacrifice is a propitiatory or gratifying offering to all sorts of deities, mainly from fruits of the earth or from the kingdom of animals. It is a cleansing from filth and attainment of spiritual purity. Let us take, for example, the Bible, which mentions sons of the progenitors make a sacrifice to God. Cain made a sacrifice from fruits of the earth, and Abel sacrificed from his flocks. In modern world religions, sacrifice is regarded as a symbol of offering something that is dear and pleasing to you out of your abundance. But if we delve into the spiritual origins of these symbolic rituals and beliefs, we can understand what true sacrifice to God is, which implies a relationship between God and man. The real sacrifice to God is when man sacrifices his animal nature at the altar of his life, that is, he renounces his numerous desires, thoughts, fleeting and temporary illusions, thus opening for himself a spiritual path to true eternity, to the world of God. A long time ago, at the dawn of mankind, this was explained to people, that the qualities of the animal nature are like fruits of the earth, which at first seduce the eye but then quickly rot. It is only by sacrificing these transient things to God that you have the opportunity to pass into His eternity, that is, by working on yourself and refusing temptations of the animal nature. And if you develop spiritually, do good, and help to awaken other people who live by their instincts like animals, then for God, this is akin to your joy that you feel as a result of a good brood of your herds. It is no coincidence that the place for sacrifice or communication of a believer with gods, which nowadays people call the altar, from the Latin altaria and from altus meaning high, originally in ancient times was indicated simply as a sign or a symbol, mainly in the form of a square, circle, oval, cylinder, cube, rhombus. All these inscriptions served as clear symbols of spiritual practices, which a person was performing in an altered state of consciousness and, while in that state, he was communicating directly with God at a deep level of feelings. And such a moment of communion with God through feelings is possible only when the personality is fully immersed in this process and is dominated solely by the spiritual nature. By making such a choice in favor of the spiritual world, a person thereby consciously sacrifices the customary for the material world domination of animal nature in his consciousness. Later, when people started losing the spiritual knowledge, material altars of similar symbolic forms began to be erected, out of clay, wood, metals. This could be a flat, round, or an oval stone, a square table, a cube, and so on. They began to set them on elevations, in temples, to orient them to a certain part of the world and make material sacrifices. Anastasia, indeed, a very serious substitution took place in the religious systems. Rigdon, and it lies not only in the substitution of the spiritual worldview with the material one. It is like losing the light inside yourself which makes things visible to your eyes. The substitution occurred at the very root of the global understanding by man of the essence of his life and the surrounding world, the aims and objectives of the temporary stay in this world. The main spiritual component, the principal spiritual guideline has been lost, service to God and continuous connection with Him. That is why the will of the animal mind seizes the human consciousness very easily. As a result, they take the illusion of this world to be the essence. Even those who hold spiritual knowledge of generations in their hands are chasing after the ashes of this world, for the material gain and banal power over their flock. Because of their pride, priests consider themselves to be the owners of this universal human spiritual knowledge, and have built a lucrative business on it, in which people become their slaves and permanent sponsors. In other words, they exist by the formula invented by priests: give money and serve us. An important point was lost: God is service to God and to people, which implies dissemination of primordial spiritual knowledge, thus enabling the personality to fuse with the soul and for the human being to independently attain spiritual liberation. Anastasia, yes, the animal mind has truly enslaved the modern people. As the ancients would say, man, instead of the free bird which aspires for spiritual heights, has become like a bird's feather, which the wind carries all over the world at its whim. People noticed a long time ago that boundless increase in material profit and power does not imply improvement of morality. Rigdon, quite true. So then, the ritual of sacrifice has existed since ancient times. Besides, note that it was typical of different forms of the development of religion, tribal, ethnic, state, and global ones. In the format of religion, it was mainly treated as a magic act, a ritual of making a sacrifice, offering gifts, to supernatural powers, spirits, or gods with the aim of expressing their devotion to these forces and achieving, thanks to them, so to speak, a certain influence on the state of matter, people and natural phenomena, in a way that is supernatural for the human being. At that, a variety of types of sacrifices was used. For example, burning incense of aromatic herbs as cleansing from filth or asking spirits and gods for something earthly. Hanging colorful pieces of cloth for the propitiation of elements in the places of power and of dwelling of shamanic spirits, in mountain passes, and near holy springs. Anastasia, yes, sacrifices of the products of gathering and agriculture are also known for the purpose of a better harvest the following year, a better hunt, or a better catch next time. Cattle were also sacrificed for an increase in offspring or as a request for something related to the affairs of a community or a person in this world. Rigdon, correct, that is, there were all kinds of different sacrifices in the system of various religious beliefs, ranging from harmless smoking of aromatic herbs to sacrifice of virginity, temple homosexuality, bloody sacrifices of parts of a human body, and the very human lives. And in most cases, all this was done by priests to acquire certain power in the material world, in other words, for earthly purposes. Anastasia, the most interesting thing is that this happened not only in ancient times but is also being done now, both in religions and in closed secret occult societies, for example, among the archons. And this despite the fact that the world community has long condemned human sacrifice and similar savagery of the priests of the distant past. I'm sure that for the readers, just like for me in my time, it will be very interesting to know why such sacrifices have been made throughout the history of mankind and why this phenomenon is quite alive in the human society. Why has so much attention been paid to this in religious structures? What is the source of such a substitution of the spiritual knowledge for zealous service to the matter of this word? Rigdon, it is, of course, quite a serious question. But if people today are already starting to think about this as well, then, perhaps, it is worth imparting its global essence. In the material world, there is a single animal mind, which I have mentioned more than once. Today, even modern science records some of its manifestations, which are mainly visible in the behavior of communities of living beings. For example, starting with reproduction and attack of a quorum of bacteria on cells and ending with collective migration, aggression, the self-destruction of animals, and so on. Speaking of which, the Latin word quorum means of which there are enough, that is, a sufficient number from a community. In science, this phenomenon is called collective intelligence. A sense of quorum, particularly one which is directed at domination, control, and capture of matter as well as devouring of it, controls many processes both in the micro and in the macro world. In medicine, for example, cancer cells have been observed to act together as an intelligent community. Even when exposed to medication, they transmit signals to each other and stand still for some time, that is, together they block the effect of the drug. Each cell, while getting certain signals from the quorum, changes the model of its behavior according to the general behavior, collective intelligence. In other words, this is, in fact, an intelligent organism within an intelligent organism. Today much research has accumulated in the field of biology about the life of communities of bees, ants, mice, rats, dolphins, and large mammals, where the dominance of the collective intelligence is clearly seen. Manifestations of domination of one matter over another exist everywhere, including in space. This has also been observed by astronomers in the behavior of planets and star systems. For instance, not far from us, in the star clusters of the Milky Way, there are giant stars which are, in essence, vampires. These are binary stars, where one of the stars simply pulls matter onto itself in the form of gas from its partner, to which it is very closely located. And then it completely absorbs this star, consequently, extending its own life and becoming a supergiant star for some time. It is all the same, according to the same laws of domination of matter. Not to mention a collective impact of communities of planets and galaxies on the processes occurring in outer space, that is, that which humanity still cannot study as of today, given the insufficient level of technological capacity. But these phenomena do exist, and even today one can find much indirect evidence of this. So, submission to the unified animal mind is typical of any matter, including the human community, which consists of beings that partly have material nature. The single animal mind has a common origin, itself, and its own units in the form of collective and individual minds. Figuratively speaking, it is like an independent organism with its multi-level structure and organization. Incidentally, the word organism is derived from the Greek word organon, which means a tool, an instrument. To make it easier to understand all of its complexity and coherence in governance, I will give an example of the human body, which functions as a single whole. The body has different levels of organization, molecular, cellular, tissue, and so on. It has a common mind, brain, which coordinates the work of all its biological systems and thus supports the life of the body. Also, there are systems to which organs are subordinated. There are organs, in which cells work in a certain general rhythm. There is a cell as the lowest level of organic individuality, which has its own structure and the ability to replicate, exist, and so on. But that same cell is a part of organs, a part of the system, part of the whole organism. It is the same in the structure of the unified animal mind of matter. There are many units of collective and individual minds, which closely interact with each other, thus creating entire systems in micro and macro world, which are subordinate to the one animal mind. Anastasia, since we are talking about controlled matter, then Ahriman should be involved in it somewhere? Rigdon, precisely. Ahriman is the one who has power over the one animal mind and uses it for the purpose of separating, so to speak, a pure soul for the world of God through material filters. Anastasia, I think it will be interesting for any person who stays on the path of self-perfection to find out how the animal mind acts in a human being. Rigdon, it manifests its will in different ways, through the animal nature, through the activity of the back and lateral essences when they work in its mode, the material body. Anastasia, yes, given that most people identify themselves solely with a reflection in the mirror, thinking that the body is them, as people say, for real. Rigdon, if man were only the body, he would thoroughly know all the subtle nuances of controlling it and live by managing tens of thousands of various vital functions and operations which constantly take place in his body. But the body, as a single organism, mainly functions in the mode that is independent of the personality's consciousness. And what does a person see in his body without a mirror? What does he see here and now with eyes open, in the visible world? He sees only that which he is allowed to see with the two little windows, eyes, initially designed for observing this three-dimensional external world from the dark room of his consciousness. Will the personality see and know much about itself or the diversity of the world in such a way? Are thoughts and emotions the product of his consciousness? And does the person know from where and how they appear? The animal mind constantly influences a person in one way or another through its branch, the animal nature, which is part of the material world. In most cases, people do not even understand this. Thoughts are simply there, and the person thinks that this is his own property. It is difficult for people to catch actions and thoughts from the animal mind inside themselves when they do not know about their dual nature and, naturally, do not monitor all this inside themselves. The result is that they perceive manifestations of the will of the animal mind as their own thoughts, desires, emotions, and so on. In reality, a human being is free only in his choice, but he is not free from thoughts because his consciousness, the observer, does not actually produce them. He only chooses between two flows, thoughts and stimuli from the spiritual nature, his will, or thoughts and desires from the animal mind, his will. That is, the person can choose the will which he liked or which has tempted him, and apply to it the power of his attention which begets action. This is precisely the key moment of the human choice. Anastasia, yes, the person only chooses whether or not to accept this or that invading mood, emotion, thought. Many readers already understand this in practical terms by tracking their thoughts during the day. Here, for example, is a typical situation which people describe in their letters. I've noticed so many times that everything seems to be fine, and then suddenly a negative thought or an emotion appears, and the mood becomes despondent for no apparent reason. Apathy to everything arises as well as a feeling of inner tension, anxiety, and fear. But I didn't want it, it happens as if by itself, sort of without my desire. The most interesting thing is that if you start to simply ignore bad thoughts or emotions, which surged suddenly, and intentionally focus on something good, for example, on good thoughts or a good deed, then with time this negativity retreats, as if this state has never existed at all. And if you give in to a bad mood, begin to feel sorry for yourself and so on, in other words, if you give your attention to negative emotions, then this state only gets worse and starts to live inside you, or rather, to poison your life like a parasite. After that, it is quite difficult to sit down to meditate. I simply force myself. On the other hand, when you are already performing a spiritual practice, here you already switch to the state of inner freedom, which is dear to you, to the feeling of immense gratitude and love for all that exists, to the purity of feelings. Rigdon, certainly, in this switching, ignoring of thoughts from the animal nature, choice, and affirmation of the domination of the spiritual nature is the essence of work on yourself. The animal mind forces people to oppose their spiritual nature, to believe only in the domination of matter, in its indivisible, undying material body. When a person falls into depression, engages in self-blame or, on the contrary, is enveloped in dreams of material desires while pursuing earthly fame, wealth, and so on. All this indicates that at this moment he, without noticing it himself, is subordinate to the will of the animal mind and is easily controlled by its system. Anastasia, a person, in fact, can trace moments of manifestation of the animal mind by the presence of exciting ideas and material desires from the animal nature. Rigdon, yes, but provided that the person will be tracking manifestation of such thoughts and desires in himself but not participating in this process and not strengthening it. Control of the human life by the animal mind is so commonplace that man himself practically does not notice this, writing off its manifestation to his thoughts, desires, habits, character, and so on. But an obvious submission to the will of the animal mind can be traced in actions of the so-called by psychologists expressive crowd and even more so, of the acting crowd if the key moment in its activation is the domination of the animal nature. That is exactly the dominance of the animal mind and its manifestation through collective intelligence in a raging crowd. In general, it should be understood that all the individuals with character lose their individuality in a crowd very quickly. They become malleable in the common melting pot of collective intelligence. In such an environment, everyone quickly gets infected with general excitement, impulsiveness, and fast-acting, thoughtless mutual responsiveness. Basically, people in a crowd lose their individuality and become a mass. An individual loses self-consciousness, and in him awaken the bursts and emotions, typical for the common will of the crowd. Moreover, these bursts and emotions are already not subject to the usual for the person limitation and daily control, which he normally exercises over them. That is, collective intelligence, subordinated to the animal mind, is inherent in the human society, given the fact that people are also a part of the material world. There is a substantial difference between when a person is in a crowd and is subordinate to the will of the animal mind and when the person is in a group of people, but everyone keeps their true individuality. In the first case, a total domination of the animal nature takes place in his consciousness, it is narrowed, and only material desires, incentives, and animal instincts are active in it, while the spiritual nature is blocked. In a crowd, an individual vanishes as a personality, there is only the organism of the crowd with the single animal mind. But when the spiritual nature dominates in a person and he is in a group of like-minded people, who, for example, are doing common good, creative work together, then he keeps his true individuality, by which is meant the connection of his personality with the soul, God. He can feel other people, as they say, be on the same wavelength with them, rejoice in their successes, but his consciousness will still be expanded, and he will maintain a constant individual connection with the soul through his attention and the deepest feelings. A similar process occurs also during collective meditations when people are performing a spiritual practice together, but everyone has a personal connection with their spiritual nature. Anastasia, when basic primordial knowledge about the spiritual nature is lost in society, and the remaining echoes are thoroughly reworked by religions, it is difficult for people to understand what the domination of the will of the spiritual nature is in society and in each person. Today it sounds as a legend about heaven on earth. But when it comes to domination of the will of the animal mind in the crowd, examples abound, although people, for the most part, do not understand the essence of the invisible source of impact and the reason why this phenomenon is inherent in the human society. Modern science already has a lot of research in social psychology, in the study of the problems of crowd behavior. If one becomes familiar with it, one will be able to understand that all the characteristics of the animal nature are quite typical for that same aggressively acting crowd. For example, an aggressive crowd is driven by the common emotion of anger, rage, and blind hatred. This will, which is alien to the spiritual nature of man, directs actions of people in a crowd towards destruction and killing of their own kind. A panicking crowd is overtaken by the common emotion of fear. People exposed to its influence, while fleeing, like any other herd of animals, can trample their fellow human beings in panic. People lose humaneness at this moment and become beings with a domination of animal instincts, as they say, they lose their heads from the fear and desire to save only themselves. The dominating emotions of the so-called money-grubbing crowd are such qualities of the animal mind as greed and the desire to possess greater material wealth. Or, for example, the rebellious crowd, which is a constant attribute of all revolutions and coups. It is a typical conductor of the will of the animal mind if we consider what actions it commits in its madness: killing people, pogroms, arson, the desire to seize weapons, tendency to absolute power, violence, ferocity, and so on. Rigdon, absolutely correct. At the heart lies an emotion conductor of the will of the animal nature, and also the same laws of influence and struggle for domination of one matter over another. Although humanity, for the most part, does not have even a general idea of the impact of the animal mind upon it, however, the subject of its isolated manifestations, such as various kinds of crowd behavior, is studied diligently, especially by intelligence agencies of different countries. Moreover, there is development and implementation of technologies that use the fact of such unconscious actions of people in a crowd to achieve certain political or religious goals. For example, it has long been known that the most trivial street accident, let us take a traffic accident, for instance, gathers an unintended crowd in the form of curious passers-by. This crowd gets infected with emotions of the same type of what has happened, that is, a so-called by psychologists circular reaction takes place, growing emotional infection in the crowd. It starts, as usual, with a discussion who saw what, who, and how was driving, how the driver was turning and which of the drivers is to blame. But such an aggravation of emotional passions may well end in a quick transformation of the crowd from being an occasional one, accidental, from the Latin word occasio meaning occurrence, to expressive, with the topic being changed from discussing the road accident to the blame game of who is responsible for the terrible quality of roads, bad life, and lack of order in society. If such emotions are heated, it is not far from the transformation of the crowd to an acting one. Perhaps, to better understand exactly how it happens, I will describe a classical scheme of how secret services use the technologies of changing power based on such effects of crowd infection. Moreover, these methods are practiced both by competing states and by the country's own services in different states. For example, at about the same time in different parts of a capital city, suddenly road accidents take place. Naturally, random crowds of onlookers appear, among whom specialists are found who, with their speeches, can turn an occasional, unintended, crowd into an acting one, and direct it to riots and unrest to overthrow one regime for another. Also a similar infection of the crowd, only by other means and other different schemes, which cause the manifestation of the animal mind in masses, can be traced to a series of prepared and artificially made color revolutions in various countries of the world. Anastasia, the sad thing is that most people are unaware of this, and as a result, such technologies still work in the crowd. If man knew about it, he wouldn't be another pawn in someone else's hands, he wouldn't consciously give in to the will that is alien to his spiritual nature and wouldn't be its active conductor, burdening his personality with the weight of material dominance. But maybe it also happens because of the human habit to live by giving preference in daily life to thoughts and emotions of the animal nature. Besides, people tend to copy the behavior of others. And many today do not care about the cleanliness of their thoughts. Maybe that is why the animal mood in society is transmitted more often and faster than anything good, spiritual, and positive. And it spreads among the population like fire along a detonating fuse. Many people encounter such phenomena, but, unfortunately, they are not always aware of them. For example, they meet their friends or relatives, who, as a rule, start telling them about someone whom they met today or recently, with whom they talked and who strongly impressed them with their negative actions or words. And what's interesting is that the person does not simply relay the words of the disturber of his peace of mind, but he tries to copy his anger to a T, his emphasis on certain words, and show his gestures. In other words, while transmitting this information, he is overtaken by the same emotions and the power coming from the animal mind. Besides, without realizing it, he, as a conductor, tries to pass them on, forcibly imposing negativity already onto his friends, colleagues at work, and members of the household. In general, taking into account how common this phenomenon is in the world society and how many times a day different people do this on the scale of mankind, a rather sad situation emerges. Rigdon, it is just that people need to understand the cause of such situations, ignore the will of the animal mind, and not to be another of its conductors. Otherwise, if the person gives a lot of personal attention at this moment, for example, to the conversation that captured him, then he will be infected with this and become another conductor of the animal mind. As a result of such an infection, a person will crave to tell this news to his other friends, often with a trick from the animal nature, as a pretext to discuss or belittle someone, to laugh at someone, and always copying emotions in the same way. The animal nature is strong in people when they do not know about it and do not keep track of its manifestation in themselves. Anastasia, it's also interesting that news about something good, kind, and especially about something significant in the spiritual sense does not spread as fast as in the case with the emotional news from the animal nature. And what is typical is that a person, while sharing the good news, tries to say it in his own voice, as if reproducing some wisdom from this news, as though from himself personally. Rigdon, unfortunately, it is not common that modern people serve as conductors of the spiritual world. That is why they see events on television but do not see them without it, they listen to the words of a person but do not understand him without words, they can read books in different languages but they cannot read the book of their lives. They aspire to go with the flow of the river of their lives, stand against the flow, looking for meaning in this, but do not understand that the meaning of their existence is on the other side. Many live just by the dead appearance of things, blindly serving the animal mind. But one must live by that which begets creation, one must live by the spiritual creation and serve the spiritual world. Only then will the person see events, understand people, and be able to adjust his life from the perspective of an observer from the spiritual nature. Anastasia, I would also like to touch on a sore subject of modern society, addiction of some people to alcohol and drugs. At one time you were saying how the animal mind brings the personality under the control of its will through these poisons, how addiction to them develops unnoticed by it, and what the person loses when he falls under this influence, which is alien to his spiritual nature. Rigdon, yes, this is a special topic. One of the ways of the animal mind to completely place a person under its control is to provoke in him the desire to consume alcohol or drugs. When a person begins to consume alcohol or drugs, the animal mind begins to completely dominate over him, to enslave and block any possible manifestation of the power from the spiritual nature. At the level of neurophysiology, an imbalance occurs, and many of the brain's neurons get blocked. The person begins to perceive information poorly. Instead, the animal nature actively dominates in him, and it seems to him that he is a hero and that everything in this world is permissible for him. Such a soap bubble, illusion, actually appears not because of the fact that he is such in reality, but simply because failure in the system of brain function occurs. And the personality's state of consciousness switches to a different mode, where there is a complete submission to the animal nature. For the spiritual nature in a person, this is a collapse, this is like, figuratively speaking, putting the soul into a deadly poisonous environment. Its power is partially blocked by the optical filter's subpersonalities anyway, and such a total domination of the animal nature in a new personality simply deprives it of its last chance and hope. Alcohol and drugs turn a person into an obedient slave of the animal mind and even in small doses kill in him the spiritual sprout. With time, an alcohol or drug addiction develops in a person, and he denies it. At the same time, this person persists in consuming this poison, citing any reasons, traditions, holidays, birthdays, funerals, personal stress, and so on. As a result, he does not notice his spiritual foundations being lost, this addiction escalating into debasing his human nature to the level of animal instincts, and the personality degrading. I have already mentioned that people in the state of alcoholic intoxication are inadequate in perceiving information. In most cases, all that dominates in them at the moment of alcoholic intoxication, practically poisoning, are the thoughts aloud from the animal nature about the dear self, about the objects of their pride, about their unfulfilled selfish desires, and unrealized excessive ambitions. This truly is a real tragedy and, first of all, for the personality itself. As for people who are seriously engaged in their spiritual development, their body just physically cannot tolerate these poisons, alcohol and drugs. Why? It is because while consuming these toxic substances, the subtle connection with the other, the spiritual world disrupts. Using modern language, extrasensory abilities are lost. While under the influence of alcohol or drugs, a person is incapable of reading information that comes from the invisible world, his supernatural powers simply fade. All that he perceives in such a state is a manifestation of the will of the animal mind, which the person considers to be his own thoughts and desires. This was known in ancient times. This is also well known now. For example, in the Soviet Union, there was a powerful system of special services, which included, among other things, departments involved in the study of paranormal phenomena and psychic development among some of their employees, for example, sleepers. So, even the dairy product kefir was excluded from their diet, not to mention a strict ban on alcohol and drugs. Smoking was, technically, allowed, although nicotine and tar intoxicate the body, they do not block mirror neurons, and, consequently, they allow unimpeded work with the invisible world and reading of the necessary information. So, the person who consumes even small amounts of alcohol, no matter for how long, degrades spiritually as a personality. If the desire appears to consume alcohol or to use drugs, these are the first symptoms that you are under control of your animal nature. That means you need to take measures to switch the dominant of consciousness, to increase emphasis on some positive aspects, exercise, perform physical labor. It should be noted that if the person completely stops drinking or using drugs, the body eventually recovers, and the person gets an opportunity for spiritual development of his personality. Matter's intelligence is very active. It is its manifestations when thoughts about reaching some boundless freedom by means of alcohol or drugs are imposed on the unbelievers with material thinking. It is its manifestations when thoughts about getting supposedly one of the possibilities of some kind of sacred knowing or perceiving spiritual heights by means of alcohol or drugs are imposed upon the believers. All these thoughts are an illusion of the animal nature which, one way or another, pushes people to continual dependence on the will of the animal mind and creates attractive thought forms associated with taking another dose of this poison. Anastasia, many people simply do not see obvious facts and do not stop and think about why this happens to them and to their friends and why this problem still exists in society. They do not ask themselves the questions, how does a persistent alcohol dependency arise and form? Who has artificially introduced it into society and who is actively supporting such a fatal for the spiritual nature tradition? After all, the person destroys not only himself and his personality, but also creates problems in the society around him. This is a real calamity, especially when the person is responsible for his family and children. After all, it's not about how many material goods he was able to provide for his children. The point is how many spiritual riches the person was able to give them with his own life's example. After all, children are not personal property and not a crutch, on which the person intends to lean in old age. First and foremost, these are new personalities, whose consciousness is a blank slate. They came into this world, just like everyone else, to gain their chance of spiritual liberation. In fact, from an early age, these new personalities observe and adopt the life experience of the previous generations from people who are of authority to them, mostly from parents, who in many ways serve as an example to them. If a family has traditions related to, For example, drinking alcohol, then what is demonstrably imposed upon children since childhood is negative experience and templates of dependence on the animal nature, which adults show by drinking, for example, at celebrations at home. People consider it to be a harmless action because they do not understand its essence and long-term consequences. Rigden, they do not understand the misery they commence by doing this, dooming the souls not only of their children but also of their descendants to suffering. However, the situation can be rectified if people start to work first of all on themselves, if they actively change the society itself, in which they live, for the better. Regarding society, here one must get to the root of who makes alcohol and drugs popular among people and why is it still being done? This information can be found quite easily even today. The first ones to introduce drugs and alcohol into mass consumption by people were priests and politicians, who saw obvious benefits in it for themselves. And why? Because, as I have said earlier, the personality's spiritual component is blocked with the help of drugs and alcohol, and the person can then easily fall under the influence of an alien will. It becomes easier for conductors from the animal mind to control him and manipulate his consciousness as part of the crowd, biomass. Suffice it to look at the realities of today. Why is all this actually being quietly encouraged despite the clearly visible struggle against these phenomena throughout the world? There is the same propaganda as in the ancient times, but only on a more massive scale, of distribution of alcohol and drugs not only through products themselves and their advertising but also through the formation of stereotypes, their introduction into the mass culture of society. For example, through a massive influence of mass media as well as through popular cultural projects and feature films. After all, the easiest way is to encode a person with behavior patterns to subordinate him to the system through the images of idols and their habits, because any individual, as I have already said, is inclined to imitate. In general, it is not all as simple as it seems at first glance. Anastasia, this, unfortunately, is the truth of today. Rigden, but again, who prevents people themselves from bringing order to society? Who prevents the personality from disciplining its thoughts? Everything is in the hands of people themselves. One just needs to be a good example for others and to at least create a favorable environment around oneself in this regard, not to encourage people to consume alcohol and drugs and not to create conditions for spreading this animal addiction among people. To do everything possible to promote spiritual knowledge in mass culture as well as cultural and moral values, and examples of the image of a real human. Anastasia, hopefully, people will become inspired by this knowledge. If it is possible, please, shed some light on a few other points about the animal mind. You said that it mainly acts through collective and individual minds, in other words, through its subdivisions. Could you clarify its manifestation on a wider scale using an example of the human society? Rigden, these processes can be tracked both in the micro and macro COSM. People, because of the duality of their nature, are not only able to consciously approach the study of them but also to create their society on a truly spiritual basis. After all, while developing spiritually, the person has an opportunity to be an observer from the spiritual nature and, therefore, to understand manifestations of the animal mind. He is able to track its actions and correct his development, without allowing this will, which is alien to his spiritual nature, to interfere with his life. Same with society. For example, now there are many scientific papers on study and monitoring of the nature of public mood. It is just that for the most part they are reduced to the results of the political and priestly control of the masses. But that is not the point. Even in these papers, one can find parts that are quite fascinating. The mood is a psychological derivative. The subject of mass moods is a certain mass, a number of people, a crowd, that is united due to an action of some factor. Emotions, feelings, and other psychological manifestations, which reflect people's behavior, can serve as such a factor. Rumors which, as a rule, are negative, serve as an impulse for the formation of a mass. They create hidden resentment in a person, because of activation of the back and the lateral essences. We have already spoken about how fast these rumors spread and how people willingly serve as conductors of the will of the animal mind. If most people believe in such rumors, in other words, put the power of their attention into them, then, accordingly, they themselves become carriers of this will, contributing to its further dissemination. As a rule, a chain of rumors is built on the opposition of we and they. People's consciousness becomes narrowed to the present situation, and they do not see the root, the real reason that gave rise to the hotbed of tension. That is why people gather in crowds in the street, wishing to improve their lives, but as a result, it ends in frustration and deterioration of their lives or simply with bloody slaughter. History knows enough examples when the people who came out into the streets even simply in peaceful support of some movement, after joining the crowd, later did not themselves understand what happened to them personally and what made them run with everyone and wreck the infrastructure of their own city, in which they were to live tomorrow. So, the following are inherent to mass moods: a stimulus, reaction to it, and readiness for action. Such a mass arises depending on a situation and reacts to one and the same stimuli in an identical manner. It is united by a psychic connection which, in its turn, is created out of similar emotions and impulses. This special mental state is uniform for most people. Moreover, it usually contains a certain destructive charge and has a hidden negative direction. If people were able to capture the movement of the energy of thought forms in the crowd, they would see that it has the form of a spiral with a counterclockwise direction. One and the same words and emotions are reproduced over and over again while increasing their intensity due to a greater excitation of conductors themselves, who excite each other, and the connection, capture, of the consciousness of the new people willing to listen to speakers or understand the situation. Then the search for the guilty party begins, to whom all kinds of negative qualities are attributed. In the end, the situation may develop into an outpouring of all this negative energy of the mass onto any given or the nearest object or onto the individuals who, in the crowd's opinion, have anything to do with the cause of their troubles or are actually them. By the way, if such a stimulation of each other and circling of gossip are absent, these moods quickly lose their strength. Anastasia: yes, this is a traditional search for the scapegoat, which is typical for domination of the animal nature in the human being. It is just that all this is manifested here in a single mass, which is subjected to the influence of the will of the animal mind. Rigdon: absolutely. It should be noted that the animal mind manifests its will not only in the mood of a mass, which carries a clear destructive charge, but also in a hidden defense of that which it already considers to be his property. Infection with the will of the animal mind occurs quite quickly in a mass, like the spread of a virus. At that, the crowd, which is subject to this will and is controlled by it, thoughtlessly rejects all that disrupts or opposes it or somehow tries to break this superficial stereotype. This mass, as a single whole, directs its negativity against a potential disturber of this will. It is also typical that all the aspirations of a crowd, which is under the influence of the animal mind, are superficial. They are empty in content, the deepest feelings are not present in them, and there is no connection of an individual with his spiritual nature. Later, when man is left alone with himself, he cannot explain why he behaved in such an inappropriate and unnatural way while in the raging crowd. The answer is simple: at the moment of his presence in the mass, he was merely one of the conductors of the will of the animal mind. Anastasia: yes, basically, such manifestations are somewhat identical both in society and in attacks of the animal nature on an individual. For instance, in the books of the Holy Elders, you can find examples of their struggle with their passions. Among other things, there is also a mention that when a person abides in the spiritual state, then, using our language, the animal nature starts to test him in every possible way, not only with tempting thoughts but even with deterioration of health, aggression on the part of the people around him, and so on. In other words, with its manifestations through the visible and the invisible matter. Similar examples can be found not only in literature but also tracked in real life. For example, how differently people respond to the knowledge which has been given thanks to you and recorded in books. There are people who, after reading them, started to wake up spiritually, expand their horizons of knowledge, and try to discipline their thoughts. They merely started tracking the animal nature in themselves, without giving away their interest in spiritual work on themselves in the outer world. And, in fact, many of them noted that as soon as they started to approach this work on themselves responsibly, they were aggressively attacked by the animal nature. Moreover, both from their circles, acquaintances, relatives, and friends, who themselves are more often subject to the activation of the animal nature inside them, and from their own consciousness. The animal nature exerted desperate resistance in response to an attempt against its power in the human consciousness and sanctity of its deep-rooted patterns of thinking. Moreover, some people who were particularly persistent in spiritual work would suddenly receive aggressive meaningless calls from distant relatives, former friends, including the ones about whom they have not heard for a long time. But more often, especially in the early stages of work on oneself, out of nowhere there would appear an aggressive attack from the environment at work, at home, and again, from those people who were more susceptible to the influence of their animal nature than others. The latter, obviously, did not even suspect that at that moment they were only conductors of the animal mind's attack. Rigdon, this is natural. The animal mind will do its utmost in order to return a spiritually awakening person into the old track of the usual domination of the animal nature, to restore its former power over a cog that is breaking away from its material system. Its job is to awaken the animal fear in man and make him believe in the supremacy of matter, its forces and laws, so that the person surrenders spiritually. But, in fact, the choice always remains with the personality. Thanks to the process of spiritual development, one cognizes not only himself but also the invisible side of the surrounding world. He begins to distinguish reality from the illusion which he previously considered to be the reality. The human being, while feeling his true spiritual nature, starts to lose fears imposed by the animal nature. He begins to feel his soul and its world and understand that when he himself is a conductor of the will of the spiritual nature, then for him, in fact, there are no obstacles in the material world. So when the person abides in such a clear, expanded state of consciousness, all that remains for the animal mind in order to return its former power over this personality is to keep watch for the time when the personality weakens its spiritual control, gives into emotions or temptations with any thoughts and desires from the animal nature. One must simply understand this and not fall for its tricks. But the main thing in this process of the activity of the animal mind during the spiritual awakening of man is that the person himself, while being in the position of the observer from the spiritual nature, gains practical experience and understanding of those things before which the animal mind is powerless. The only thing the animal mind cannot resist is spiritual power. That is, when a person already consciously chooses the spiritual path and lives by his inner spiritual world, by his depth, the interconnection by means of feelings through his soul with the world of God, when he is able to not only bring it to heel but also to control his animal nature and its multiple manifestations in various emotions and desires. Of course, this fighting experience, in a way, is gained due to attacks from the animal mind, which spiritually awakening people draw upon themselves. Consciousness becomes a battlefield. But the result of the victory is worth it, for a person awakens spiritual powers within himself, strengthens them, understands the reality and the meaning of his existence, and begins to consciously seek God, strive for the spiritual world, that is, for eternity. The spiritual power given to a human being is immense. If the majority of people in the modern society can realize this simple truth, understand all the frailty and temporality of matter that surrounds them, and begin to awaken spiritually, then this will affect the whole human society in general, and the monad will turn over. This is when the golden millennium, about which people have dreamt since time immemorial, will come. Anastasia, It all starts with the first step in the spiritual direction of an individual as a unit of the structure of this society. That is why it is important for everyone to know their true nature, to know that, before which the animal mind is powerless, how to track its manifestation in oneself and prevent its domination and violence against one's personality. Rigden, absolutely, and this is much simpler than people think while being in the state of spiritual inaction. Man simply must not allow the will of the animal mind to become his reality. But let us return to our conversation about material sacrifices. The knowledge of the existence of collective and individual mind was also present in the society of that time as an integral part of spiritual knowledge. Understanding one's dual nature helped one make an informed choice, to which of the natures, the spiritual or the animal one, to devote his transient life and which will to serve. By the way, the basis of the primordial knowledge about the collective and individual minds later gave rise to archaic beliefs, for example, totemism, animism, fetishism, animatism, and shamanism. Let us consider totemism. Initially, a totem designated a certain sign, through which the person possessing spiritual knowledge could influence natural elements, processes, and fauna, in other words, matter. And much later, because of people's temptation by magical practices, increased dominance of the animal nature in communities, and the desire to achieve abundance and material well-being, people have turned all this into the totem cult, a whole set of beliefs in the supernatural kinship between tribes and certain totems, animals, plants, natural phenomena, and inanimate objects. Once again, where was the emphasis? On the people's request for the animal mind to share power with them, that is, supernatural power to achieve some worldly goods or to give them power over others and so on. As it is known, like attracts like. Magic, animism, belief in spirits and supernatural beings, and fetishism, worship of inanimate objects, fetishes which are endowed, according to people's belief, with supernatural powers, appeared in the same way. So appeared animatism, the cult of worship of impersonal, supernatural power which, in people's opinion, determines the vital processes in nature, for example, success in hunting, in war, a better harvest, and so on. Shamanism, based on the cult of spirits, faith in supernatural communication of the cult's mediator, shaman, with spirits. These cults were once formed on the basis of spiritual knowledge. After substitutions from the animal nature started to take place, priesthood was born, and race for power began. In them, knowledge of the laws of matter began to be applied in favor of the system of the animal mind. That is, people started worshipping and imitating the strongest one. They started deifying him and creating a halo of immunity. And in some cases, they would even eat the strongest one, as in some cults it was thought to be necessary to be like him and to get his strength. Moreover, representatives of such beliefs were characterized by an aggressive attitude towards any otherwise minded people. Attacking the enemy, people who worshipped other cults, and their destruction were strongly encouraged. Well, the purpose of worship of such rites spoke for themselves: enrichment, that is, multiplying material wealth, obtaining guarantees of fertility of land and people, and favor of the elements, which were achieved as a result of concluding an agreement, often in blood, with supernatural powers, that was sealed with sacrifices. Anastasia, in other words, these actions are typical for the material being, or mass, that is influenced by the will of the animal mind. Rigden, and all this worked, the elements stayed away from the villages, nature gave good harvests, and people who asked for strength and dexterity in the material world in their prayers were given these and other qualities they desired. In general, in many cases, people received from matter those benefits they asked for in return for their prayer in faith, the dominant choice, and a material sacrifice to the place where they lived. But what was the real price that personalities paid for providing their mortal bodies with these temporal, earthly benefits by the will of the animal mind? Even during the most harmless sacred ritual, people spent the power of their faith on it, their inner, creative deepest feelings, which are initially intended for personality to merge with the soul and for liberation from the captivity of matter. Otherwise, no effect would take place in the material world. Such human material desires, together with increasing comfort and conditions of existence as well as accumulation of wealth, have only contributed to strengthening the animal nature in man, to greater temptation and allure of possessing supernatural powers, divisions and strife among people, and the emergence of institutions of political and priestly power. For individual possession of this or that power led to division into clans, to conflicts and strife, which would sometimes lead people to pointless destruction of even their own families, when sons would go against their fathers because of their belief in the power of the totem of a neighboring tribe. But it must be said that in spite of such worship and sacrifice to the animal mind of matter, spiritual sprouts still made their way. That is, there were people who intuitively sought primordial spiritual knowledge in their faith, thirsting for peace, kindness, and unity. After all, along with the cult, each nation also had a rich mythology of the origin of a human being and the world, which was also originally based on the single grain of the primordial knowledge that was common to all the peoples. There were, of course, peaceful tribes who used primordial knowledge chiefly for their spiritual development, that is, as intended. They lived modestly, understanding the temporal nature and the transience of their life and the fact that it is given for the spiritual transformation of man, preparation for other, eternal life. These people obtained the food necessary for their tribe through physical labor, without spending their valuable power, which is the deepest inner feelings based on sincere faith, that is intended for spiritual development. As for the material world, they used this unique power only in extremely rare cases, for example, when they were threatened by real danger from an unexpected natural disaster, capable of destroying their entire tribe. They also had a better social organization than modern mankind. They lived in groups and were friends with each other. They had no leaders, but there were experienced people who preserved spiritual, magical, and medical knowledge and passed it on to those young people who were most talented spiritually. The person who was the most experienced in these matters was considered to be the head that was recognized by all and was elected only upon an agreement of the entire community. Everyone could turn to him for important advice. At that, this person had no special privileges or power in the group and lived like everyone else. By the way, descendants of some of these people still live now and have the same social organization. With that, they live in conditions that are much worse in comparison to those of people in civilized, to be precise, in more comfortable and affluent countries. But this does not prevent them from living humanely in their communities. Where there's a wish, there's a way. For example, the Bushmen, African peoples who speak the ancient Khoisan languages with click consonants. They are the same ones who kept records in rock paintings. By the way, the name Khoisan clicking languages is purely conditional. The word Khoisan is derived from the word Khoi meaning man, which in its turn was used to indicate the self-name of the African people Khoikhoi, who also spoke a clicking language, which means people's people or real people. Anastasia, yes, this is an interesting comparison. Real people spoke in a clicking language, which is obviously an echo of the bird language that you once mentioned as the people's first proto-language. The real human was a human even in the ancient times. As the saying goes, real people are not those that speak beautifully but those who live properly. Rigdon, absolutely. We recently mentioned in our conversation the Ainu people, who are an ancient population of the Japanese islands. This nation with European facial features once upon a time came there from the territories on which modern Russia is located. So, in the Japanese language Ainu, the English transcription of the word, literally, to, means a real human. Of course, I cannot say that their modern descendants have preserved all the knowledge, mythology, and social organization, which their distant ancestors had. But pay attention to their national dress, and you will see signs and symbols that are familiar to you and that will tell you a lot. Anastasia, interesting. So much for archaic beliefs. Speaking of signs and symbols, you have practically eliminated the serious gaps in science, white spots of the issue of genesis of archaic beliefs. Indeed, scientists have endlessly debated this issue for more than just 1 century. But many are of the opinion that it was all a caveman's misconception associated with the mindset of the primitive people. But they understand that this embryo has practically all the main elements of future world religions, which have influenced masses of people for some unknown to them reason, including in terms of sacrificial offerings. Rigdon, grinning a caveman's misconception. Modern man is no different from the primitive man, he has the same brain structure, the same thinking with its multiple desires of the animal nature, and the same impulses of the spiritual nature. As it was, so it still is on the verge of choice. Anastasia, you're right, man's own pride prevents him from understanding the truth. In every age, one can find the pundits who praise to the skies achievements of their contemporaries, criticizing the development level of previous generations. Although in the next century, these strong statements were condemned already by their own descendants. Very few paid attention impartially to the interesting facts about the spiritual development of man from the distant past. And regarding the peaceful tribe's social organization which you have mentioned, modern humans, indeed, have much to learn here. It's particularly noteworthy that everyone lived in peace and friendship, and the most experienced person unselfishly and actively helped people, living according to the ideology of good, without having any privileges or power in the community. On the whole, he lived like the rest of his people. It's a good example for those people who today consider themselves to be leaders and priests, that is, politicians and church ministers. I think that any sensible nation would like to have such a social organization. Here's an interesting comparison: if in the past, an experienced person, living like everyone else, in practice helped the community with his knowledge, by working with people individually, then in the modern world, priests and politicians not only exist separately from people, but they also try to strengthen their power through mass moods by means of various promises. Although in fact, if we follow historical examples of even thousands of years old, nobody has ever fulfilled these promises. For priests and politicians, this is just an ancient game of promises based on the people's faith. Rigdon, it is simply necessary to understand why it happens this way and why society itself supports this process, stepping on the same rake every time. All this is predictable when society is dominated by the consumer thinking. What are the promises of politicians and priests? For those in power, it is just a method of manipulating the masses, that is, public mood. This is a play on the desires and aspirations of, I emphasize, the masses, the thinking patterns of which are formed through mass media owned by those in power. For the masses, promises and assurances of politicians and priests are an expression of the consumer format that has nothing to do not only with true spirituality but also with delivering what has been promised. What the masses have been promised to be given and provided for free is what people already consider as their own in their thoughts and live by this illusion of hope. The only question here is one of personal gain, which affects their financial interests. Knowing this consumer desire of people, priests, and politicians simply manipulate the mood of the masses. For example, while people live in hopes that the priests and politicians will be keeping their promises, the latter go about their business carefree. As soon as discontent starts brewing in society and people run out of patience, a political theater of action unfolds. Incitement of negative sentiments begins in society with help of priests and politicians. Rumors are spread from their circles about who exactly is deceiving people and who is to blame for all the ills, and people's anger is focused on yet another pawn of politicians and priests, who allegedly has failed to keep his promises and whose words do not agree with his actions. People always perceive the latter as a betrayal of their needs. As a result, through mass media, those in power quickly bring the masses to the critical point, and an emotional explosion takes place. Priests and politicians remove one of their pawns and put another in its place that starts making idle promises and assurances to people exactly the same way, gaining popularity for itself through the faith of people themselves. And again, thoughts from the animal nature start running around in people in a new circle. Anastasia, so, that means that the leadership of any country in the world, in fact, corresponds to the consumer needs of their people. In other words, when some candidate or an organization, in the election campaign, state that they will help to achieve the masses' aspirations, people rush to vote for the fulfillment of their desires from the animal nature. And after the election, with the help of mass media, the illusion is simply supported in people that their desires are being fulfilled or they will be fulfilled in the near future. That is, there is a prolongation of hopes and aspirations of the masses to a certain time. And such a game of the animal mind happens from generation to generation. People, as it turns out, thus redirect the power of their attention. In other words, instead of fulfilling the spiritual needs of their personality and the soul, they waste it on nothing. And then they just sit around and wait for someone to start creating their material and spiritual life for them. That is a true substitution of reality by the animal mind. Rigdon, that is right. And such a substitution of man's actions for his inaction, especially in spiritual matters, began precisely with the creation of religion as such. In particular, with the development of the institution of priesthood, when spiritual foundations started to be substituted with material views and promises. Priests took advantage of the fact that people who perfected themselves spiritually lived by their anticipation of spiritual liberation, of future bliss in another world. On this basis, priests created the system of religion, which politicians later borrowed from them to create their system of politics. That is, through persuasions and suggestions, priests first formed a strong opinion in people that man himself is spiritually weak and sinful, and is not capable of achieving spiritual freedom without the priest's help. They instilled into masses that man can get spiritual freedom only if he slavishly carries out the priest's will, follows their rituals, and sponsors them for his entire conscious life. In other words, it was instilled that people would not be able to achieve spiritual freedom by independently working on themselves but only through intermediaries, priests. However, while launching the mechanism of influencing the masses, priests immediately suggested to people the idea of postponing the implementation of the aspirations, putting off realization of their spiritual desire for an indefinite period. For example, in eschatological religions and beliefs, in order to bind people specifically to their own religion, priests used the information about the last judgment day of the world existence, which they borrowed from other ancient religions. However, nothing was told to believers about the ancient mentions in other religions. They were just being convinced that only by abiding in this religion and serving its priests for free their entire lives, they would one day surely be saved. Thus, priests maintained their power by giving people promises of a future after death bliss, which, in fact, is an empty illusion since, without real spiritual work on itself, the personality has no future. In the political system, people's spiritual aspirations were just replaced with material desires and promises of, instead of eternity, some illusory freedom in the near future. Only politicians, unlike priests, constantly instill that without them, people will not be able to build a truly free and safe society with a good level of material prosperity and equality. They form in people faith in a good ruler, politician, who will secure a happy future for them and constantly undermine their belief in life, which society can build without politicians and priests. Therefore, both priests and politicians are interested in the consumer way of society's development, so as not to lose their power over it. Otherwise, the world society can consolidate and choose a vector in the direction of a truly spiritual development, which will naturally reject the system of political and priestly power as unnecessary.